Hi, I'm Dan Cortopassi. Today I'm going to start a new build. Last year Nicole and I bought an RV, and even though we haven't had a chance to go anywhere yet, I want to make a small layout that we can take with us so we can have trains while we're on the road. I'm going to do it in N scale, and it's going to be a combination of N and Nn3 narrow gauge. I need to make some Nn3 motive power, and I want a small engine that has a working front coupler so that it can be used for switching or road duties. One challenge with the idea of doing a combination N and Nn3 layout for our RV is that I didn't have any Nn3 motive power. Many, if not most, Nn3 steam locomotives are based on Marklin Z scale mechanisms. Microtrains released a ready-to-run 260 some years ago based on a Colorado and Southern prototype. Unfortunately, these models are hard to find and usually very expensive. I've seen them go for $600 and up on eBay. There was also a white metal kit for the same CNS 260. I found one on eBay, but the seller wanted close to $200, and you still need to supply the Marklin mechanism. I thought that was a lot for a few white metal castings. Marklin made an American-style 260 that isn't officially Nn3, but close in size, painted in the Rio Grande Bumblebee scheme. Those also usually go for around $500 and up. I've also seen a Marklin Z 460 that looks like an old-time North American-style engine, but those are also hard to find. To keep costs down, and because I didn't necessarily want a CNS prototype anyway, I decided to build my own. I found this used Marklin Z-scale European 260T on eBay for around $60. My plan is to remove the boiler casting and use the chassis as the basis for a new locomotive. This one has a missing buffer and a bent smokestack, so I don't feel too bad about getting rid of the boiler. I tested it and it runs pretty well. I'm planning to build the engine to run on DCC with working lights but without sound. This engine is going to be a little too small for that. Even if I could fit a sound decoder, the speaker would have to be so small that the sound quality wouldn't likely be very good. I'm not going to build my engine to follow a specific prototype. It'll be freelanced, but I want it to look similar to some of the rod engines used by the Pacific Coast Railway. These engines had an old-time look which is perfect for my layout concept, and some had straight boilers. If I ended up having to make a boiler from scratch, a straight boiler would be easier than a tapered boiler. My goals for this episode are to gather parts for the project, prepare the Marklin mechanism, and get a new boiler mounted on the chassis. I did some hunting around and gathered a bunch of parts that I think should build into a nice engine. I found a used Rivarossi N scale 040 boiler on eBay. I like this casting because it's small and the width of the front across the running boards is about right for a narrow gauge engine. I plan to use the boiler and smoke box from this casting. On Shapeways, I found something being sold as Nn3 conversion parts. The 3D printed set includes a cab, a tender body, a pilot, and some details including a smokestack and domes. I also found a few N-scale white metal steam engine detail part castings from Detail Associates. I bought a few of these on eBay, and others were in my stash of parts from many years ago when I was more heavily into N-scale. I picked up some Nn3 couplers from Microtrains, as well as some Microtrains trucks and metal Fox Valley wheels for the tender. I got detail part set 5005 from Showcase Miniatures, which is intended for their Nn3 Shea kit, but has some parts that will work for my project. Looking through my stash of N-scale parts, I also found this steam locomotive detailing set, Gold Medal Models Part 160-42. For this build, I'll be using an ESU Locpilot DCC decoder. I'm keeping all of the parts for this project in this plastic box so that I stay organized. I want to interject for just 1 minute and say that I'm not going to use all of these parts on this model. I'm just trying to gather all the N-scale steam details that I have in one place so that as I need parts, I can easily find them. I'll start with the Marklin mechanism. The engine has a couple of screws on the bottom, but these just hold the bottom cover plate over the driver axles. I don't want to mess with those. The boiler shell is held on by a tab and a slot at the rear. Pressing this with a small flathead screwdriver will help to dislodge it. Now I can carefully remove the boiler shell from the mechanism. Next, I'll remove the light bulb. The Rivarossi boiler casting was designed around a completely different mechanism, so getting this to work is going to require some cutting. I'll need to open up the bottom so that the Marklin mechanism can fit inside. I'll also need to remove some material from the bottom so that the boiler can sit lower, giving the engine better narrow gauge proportions. Since I have a new 3D printed cab, I'll also need to remove the existing cab from the boiler. It's too wide to look convincing for narrow gauge anyway. It's important that the new boiler assembly I'll make is securely attached to the chassis. I want to line up the threaded hole on the top of the chassis so that I can put a screw in it that'll go through the sand dome. I also want to make sure that the cylinders line up with the smokestack. It looks like the motor will be a little too far forward to fit in the existing cab, but that's okay. I was going to remove the cab anyway, and in the process I can shorten the boiler a little. In order to use the threaded hole on the mechanism, first I need to figure out what size screw it needs. After some trial and error, I found it's a 2mm by 0.4 pitch thread. Northwest Short Line set 6200-5 includes a number of fasteners with this thread. One of these 10mm panhead Phillips screws is just the thing I'll need. Because the uneven bottom will keep the boiler casting from sitting flat, I've placed it on an HO scale foam handrail protector. Now I can use my miter box and a razor saw to remove the cab. I won't lie, this is really tedious. I could probably go faster with a hacksaw, but I'm trying to be careful not to damage the boiler. This is difficult because I have to hold the boiler casting while I'm sawing it. After a while I realized that since the cut was already started, I didn't need the miter box anymore. I clamped the boiler in a vise. It's much easier to saw without the parts moving around so much. With the cut most of the way through, all it takes is a little push to separate the boiler. Now I can line up the boiler with the chassis. In order to make room for the chassis, I'll need to open up more space inside the boiler. I'll use a Sharpie to mark the boiler casting. I'll need to remove material at least up to this line. After some trial and error, I found that a 1/4 inch drill bit matches the size of the hollowed out area that's already in the boiler. I'll need to mark the drill bit with some tape so I know when to stop drilling. I'm lining up the mark I made with the tip of the drill bit. Now I can drill out the boiler. Once that's done, I'll drill a second, smaller hole from the bottom using a 1/8 inch drill bit to start removing material from the underside of the boiler. The opening in the bottom will need to be a little bigger to fit the Marklin chassis. The mechanism has a plastic part that holds the electrical contacts that go to the motor. To prevent shorting out the electrical contacts on the chassis and to set the boiler height to look right for narrow gauge, I want to remove most of the material under the walkways. I'll do my best to preserve the air pump detail. I had quite a mess to clean up after drilling out the boiler. Before I do any more grinding, I'm putting this upside down box lid on my workbench to hopefully catch most of the metal shavings. I'm using a motor tool with a fiber reinforced cutting wheel to remove most of the material. As a safety tip, I'd recommend always using a fiber reinforced cutting wheel, as a non-reinforced cutting wheel can shatter and fling bits of itself toward your face at high speeds. Always wear eye protection when doing this kind of work. Next, I'll use some flat files to smooth out the bottom of the boiler casting. I found that my large flat mill file works better than the smaller files for this job. The same cutting disc in my motor tool is good for opening up the slot in the bottom of the boiler. I'll need to test fit the mechanism as I go. It needs a little more clearance. The air pump casting is actually in the way, so I'll need to cut it back a little. It's getting closer. The mechanism is starting to fit. The boiler is still a little high and a little too far forward. It looks like I'll need to grind out some more material from the front. I'll switch to a different attachment for my motor tool. This one will let me get into tight spaces easier. When it's done, the opening in the boiler is shaped a little like a bathtub. Now I can test fit it onto the mechanism and we can get an idea of what the finished engine is going to look like. It's sitting a bit high at the front because the steps in the front of the walkways are touching the chassis. I'll file a little material from the bottom of the steps until the boiler sits level. That looks pretty good. Next, I'll drill a hole through the sand dome for the mounting screw. This will allow me to attach the boiler securely to the chassis. I'll start by filing the bump on the top of the sand dome flat. Then I can drill a dimple in the top of the dome with a pin vise. I'm going slow and making sure that the drill bit is in the center of the dome. Once I have the dimple started, to prevent drill bits from wandering, I can move up to a bigger bit. This is a 1/16 drill bit in a different pin vise. With that started, I can put the bit into a powered drill to speed things up. Working on metal parts like this can generate a lot of heat, so be careful when handling them. I found that a cordless drill at a lower RPM was more effective than a motor tool running at high RPM for this task. The 1/16 hole I drilled is a little too small for the mounting screw, so I'll need to ream it out. I'll use a 5/64 bit this time. Now the screw fits through. If you recall, I wanted the screw to fit in the threaded hole that was already in the chassis. Let's see if it works. The boiler and chassis are now assembled. This is a good place to leave things for now. We'll pick it up next time, continuing work on the boiler. By cobbling together my own parts to make this engine, I spent less than I would have on a commercial offering. My engine will also be more unique as a result. It took me a while to cut through the Rivarossi 040 boiler. Work like this can be tedious, but a little extra care and time spent here will result in a better model. Fitting parts that weren't designed to work with each other takes time and effort. it pays to be patient. Consider the shape of each part carefully to determine where to drill, where to remove material, and how to get everything to fit. For the RV layout, I'm trying to be budget conscious, so in this build I'm going to keep a running tally of costs. Looking only at the parts that I've actually used so far, I've spent approximately $60 on the Marklin 260. I actually got 2 Rivarossi 040 boilers and some other assorted small parts on eBay for about $22. Since the boilers were the main part of that deal, I'll say each one is worth about $10. That brings us to about $70 in the build so far. I think that's a good place to leave it for now. Next time I'll continue work on the boiler. Thanks for watching.